Good morning, my dear students. As first year students of literature, probably the question that first comes to your mind is, what is literature? Is it different from language? Do we need language for literature, or do we need literature for language? A definition of literature seems to be an impossibility, and down the ages, various writers, critics, thinkers, philosophers have attempted to define literature. Sometimes you begin with a very simple definition. You say great ideas, you say great language, and then you attempt to describe the chief characteristics of literature. Probably then you begin to think about universality, you begin to think about what the scope of literature should be, what the range of writing should be. But today we are going to try and look at literature in a different way. Today, in this lecture, we will be looking at literature, history and medieval romance. I'll go back to my question, can literature be defined? As one writer put it very beautifully, some texts are born literary, some achieve literariness, some have literariness thrust upon them. So the moment a work is written, it doesn't automatically become literature. And that is why we say that literature is more a functional rather than an very obvious fixed term. It is functional. What do I mean by that? Have you looked at weeds in your garden? You know what weeds are? Little plants which really are upsetting, are coming in the way, are proving to be an obstacle for whatever we want to grow. Think of a garden. Think of rose plants planted in straight lines as far as your eyes can see. And there you have suddenly, let me use a common Gujarati word, you have probably a pudina growing up there. You probably have got dhania growing there. You consider them a weed because they come in the way of the growth of your rose bushes. But let's imagine that actually you've got fields and fields of dhania and pudina. Then they are not weeds. They are something that you plan to grow, that you have decided to grow, that you encourage probably by watering them, by giving them fertilizers. Do you understand? The word literature is also like that. It is a functional word. It is not a word that can be clearly defined. What is literature? Generally, most of us would like to imagine that all imaginative writing is literature. Now, when you think of maybe the plays of Shakespeare, you say, yes, it's imaginative writing. When you look at the essays of Charles Lamb, you probably say, yes, it is imaginative writing. You think of Donne, you think of Coleridge, Wordsworth, Chaucer, Keats, Tennyson, Dickens, Thackeray, and then you say, all this is literature. But my dear students, let me ask you a very simple question. Are all these only imaginative? Or somewhere does the line between fact and fiction get blurred? Yes, you say it is imaginative writing. Let's think of Charles Dickens maybe. Let's think of a book that you are probably familiar with. Let's think of David Copperfield. And you say that it is a novel. You say that it is imaginative writing. But can you all deny that it is based on the condition of Victorian England? Is it not a fact? So, when we talk about literature, it is not always necessarily only imagination. To put it as Arnold put it, you could probably say it's a criticism of life, which means somewhere you apply your ideas to the world around you, and therefore fact and fiction get blurred. In fact, when we look at Terry Eagleton's essay, What is Literature?, the question can be asked, do you consider newspaper reports to be fact? Do you consider all novels to be fact? Do you consider all good writing to be called literature because it is imaginative? No, my dear students, we have to understand that these two levels get blurred all the time. There is a difference probably between what we can call artistic truth and what we call historical truth. And therefore, literature is imaginative certainly, but it is also a combination of fact and fiction. The word novel itself means new. The word itself, novel, today we refer to fiction as novels. But the word novel at one stage was a combination of both artistic truth and historical truth. When you think of Gibbon, who was writing his history, he probably thought it was historical truth. But do you want to consider it merely as historical truth? Or somewhere do you want to call it art and therefore combine it with our concept of literature? Do we want to think of Superman? Do we want to think of Mills and Boon novels as literature just because they are imaginative? Or do we want to say that no, it's not literature because it is not of the standard that we call literature? So, when we attempt to define literature, the first three terms that come to our mind are that it is imaginative writing, that probably it's fictional, probably there's something novel, there's something new about it. Terry Eagleton, in his introductory essay, What is Literature?, begins with this question. And then he goes on to saying that maybe literature is not about themes. He says maybe what we need to really look at literature is to look at the way language is used. Maybe what we are looking at is not the theme. Maybe what we are not looking at is what it is about, what the characters are, who the characters are, what is the kind of milieu, what is the surrounding, what is the social surrounding. Maybe all that is not really important enough, he says, maybe not important enough to decide whether literature is literature, whether a work of art can be called literature. Maybe what we really need to look at is the use of language that is there in what we consider to be a literary text. Let me say that again to you, my dear students, to make it clearer. What we need to look at in any text which we want to consider to be literature is not the theme, is not what it is about, is not what the story is about, but instead to look at the use of language. And a Russian critic, Jacobson, put it very strongly when he said, organized violence committed on ordinary speech. Organized violence committed on ordinary speech. What do we mean? What do we mean by that? That there is a language which is ordinary language. There is a language which is everyday language. And what we are looking at is not the everyday speech. We are not looking at the everyday speech. We are looking at a specific use of language. We are looking at language being used in a different way. And Jacobson uses a rather strong term when he says it is organized violence. Because what we are trying to do is to use this language in a different way. When I say language, I'm not talking about English or Gujarati or Hindi. But what I mean is the particular language in which the literary text is being written, we do not use it the same way in which we use it in everyday language. And he puts it very beautifully, Eagleton, when he says, if somebody you meet at the bus stop addresses a young girl as unravished bride of quietness, you immediately know that this is not ordinary language. This is a kind of special language. Maybe this is a kind of literature. This is the kind of language that writers use in literature. Taking it a little further, we can say that in literature, he says, language believes in a particular organization. It believes in a specific laws. It believes in structures and devices. The language that is used in literature has laws which are different from everyday language. The structure that we use in literature is different. And that is why, my dear students, we know that we very often talk about the language of poetry. Because inversions, for example, grammatical inversions are very common in poetry. But if you were to use it in your answer books, you would immediately find a big red line under it. Because the structure that we use in prose, the structure that we use in everyday writing, in everyday speech, in everyday language, is necessarily different from the kind of language that is used in literature. Eagleton goes one step further and he tells us that it would be interesting to look at what the formalists had to say about the use of language in literature. How did the formalists attempt? The formalists, my dear students, a small group, very, very popular in the early part, in the first quarter of the 20th century. They lasted for about 15-20 years in a very, very big way. And then somewhere along the line, their popularity as a group gradually began to wane till it finally disappeared. To them, the application of linguistics is what determines whether a work is literature or not. Let's look at what the formalists had to say about the approach to literature, about what makes literature. And they put it, in fact, very strongly when they say that what writers attempt to do is to work on language in such a way as almost making it stand on its head, he says. They condense, they twist, they intensify, they telescope, and they draw out language. Look at the words that are being used, words that we generally do not associate with language, words that we generally associate with things. But the formalists say that this is what writers of literature do to language in general. What do? They intensify language, they condense language, they twist language to exactly convey what they want to say. They also telescope language. That means sometimes they highlight something, but at the same time they can make something seem much, much smaller than what it actually is. But in order to do that, they need to use devices. And what are these devices? In ordinary language, we refer to them as figures of speech. I'm sure you remember some of the figures of speech that you've learned in different languages. In Hindi, Gujarati, or in Sanskrit, we call them alankar. And we all know that there are different kinds of alankar. Have you ever thought about it, my dear students? How these figures of speech, if you want to understand it better, think of it as alankar. How these different figures of speech are so common a part of our everyday language. Don't we all use comparisons when we say as cold as ice, as white as milk, as slippery as an eel? When you use all this, what are you doing? You're actually using a literary device. You are actually using a figure of speech. But what happens in literature? When a writer uses these, he uses them much more. And therefore, we become conscious, we become aware, we realize what the writer is doing to language. According to Eagleton, this is what the formalists believed gives literature a particular quality. This use of language, this use of devices is what gives literature a particular quality. What do they achieve, these writers, by using these devices? By estranging, by alienating, by making language stand on its head. According to the formalists, what it succeeds in doing is to make it strange. And it's a beautiful comparison that Singleton uses here when he says, we are not conscious of the oxygen that we are breathing. It's so obvious that you need oxygen in order to live. It's so obvious that you're breathing in oxygen every moment that we are alive. What happens when suddenly you are deprived of oxygen? It is in the same way that when language is twisted, we realize that language is being used in a different way. In this discussion, in continuing this discussion, we go on to say that language can be called a non-pragmatic discourse. He talks about how literature can be distinguished from the sciences, which we consider to be pragmatic, and therefore literature can be non-pragmatic. Literature shows us that there is a specialized use of language. How do I know this? Because it is a context which tells me that this use of language is different from the everyday use of language. And therefore, according to Eagleton, having gone through the entire gamut of what the formalists say, having gone through what he thinks literature is not, having attempted to explain how in different ages we have come to different conclusions, different ideas about what literature is, having realized and having made us realize that very often a writer might be writing for a theme, but we might be reading the same writer for the style. This may not be in keeping, may not be in consonance with what the writer actually wanted to do. But yet, when we read it, we are reading it from a specific point of view. We are reading it for a specific reason. We are reading it because the writer has been able to make such wonderful use of language. And the examples that he gives, my dear students, takes into consideration the entire gamut of literature. Terry Eagleton is able to give us examples, not merely from the well-known texts of English literature, from Chaucer and Shakespeare, to Donne, to Dickens, to Cervantes, and to Animal Farm. It's not that he's only talking about George Orwell, but he also takes into consideration all the wonderful writing, the histories that have been written. He talks about Gibbon, he talks about Marx and Bentham. And in reading this essay, you will get a fantastic idea about what literature can be, what literature is attempting to do, and what, according to Terry Eagleton, are the main characteristics, the main ideas of what literature is all about. But I want you to remember that the conclusion that he draws is that literature is never the study of a well-defined entity. If you can think of entomology as being the study of insects, which gives us an exact point, literature is never the study of a well-defined entity. And the reasons he gives us, remember, is because the approach to literature is equally important. It changes. Literature is not, I want you to notice, unchanging and unchangeable. If it is not unchanging and unchangeable, what does it mean? Remove the two negatives and the answer that you have, that it is constantly changing and it is constantly changeable. What does it mean? It means that it is historically variable. Where you are standing, at which point of time, at which point of space you are standing, when you look at a piece of literature, what has been called literature down the ages. When you look at a text which is considered to have literary value, please remember it also depends on the power structure, on the place in which, on the space in which you are standing when you look at it. And therefore, Eagleton concludes that it can never be purely objective. All literature, when read, has a subjective angle to it. And that is why he says, when values change, our approach to literature changes. When values change, our attitude of what constitutes literature changes. And he would somehow like to relate it to the power structure, because in each age, literature is again rewritten. In fact, Eagleton goes as far as to argue that there is nothing which is a permanent value. And he argues that when values change, maybe we'd even begin to question whether Chaucer or Shakespeare is literature at all. He gives us a fantastic example of a test which the great critic I.A. Richards conducted in his class at the university. And the students were asked to judge various poems without being told who wrote it and in which age it was written. Strangely enough, interestingly enough, probably intriguingly enough, it was realized that most of the well-known poems by well-known poets did not get as many marks as those by very unknown writers. What does it prove? It proves that values change, attitudes change, opinions change. And therefore, my dear students, I want you to understand that literature cannot ever be a well-defined, definable entity. Literature is always changing and changeable, and literature cannot be an objective category, which means it becomes a subjective category. What I've attempted to do in the first part of this lecture is to give you some idea about what constitutes literature. And in attempting to do that, I've based my lecture on Terry Eagleton's essay, What is Literature? And the conclusion that we are drawing, my dear students, that it's not very easy to define literature. We know what literature is not. We know what constitutes literature down the ages. We also know that literature, the approach to literature, and what constitutes greatness to literature is a constantly changing phenomenon. I want you to remember that these modern writers have attempted to define for us certain terms which earlier we thought could be fit into slots, which we thought could be easily defined, which we thought 2 plus 2 is always 4. But what these modern writers and critics are attempting to do is to tell us that things change, and therefore our attitude, our approach to what was earlier considered to be well defined also changes. Let us now move on to the second part of the lecture. This is about history and facts. Have you ever attempted to understand how we come to know about a particular age? Let's think of any age in history. Let's think of Indian history. Let's think of the Gupta age or the Maurya age or the Mughal age or the British period. Any period that we think of and we want to know what happened, we think we go to books of history. And when we go to the books of history, we get some answer. And that tells us something about the age. But what I'm now going to do is to look into another essay, which is called The Historian and His Facts. But what we are attempting to do here is not just talk about history, but somehow relate history and literature. I asked you, where do you get your facts about the Mughal age, the Gupta age, the Maurya age? Let me ask you, when you read a piece of work, when you read something that has been written, when you read something that has been written in the Mughal age, when you read something that has been written in the Gupta age, a poem maybe, an essay maybe, don't you think you get much more about the period? You know how the people lived, you know what they wore, you know what they ate, you know what they thought. All this might not come so clearly, so seriously, so obviously when you read history. And therefore, what you need to do is to look at this essay, which Carr, a famous historian, Edward Carr, and the essay is called The Historian and His Facts. Where does a historian get his facts from? Where does a historian begin to write his essay? If you were to put it in modern computer language, can you always cut, copy, paste and write a book of history? Or is there something else that you need to do? He collects his facts. He gets his facts. And where does he get his facts from? If you're looking at ancient history, if you're looking at medieval history, where he needs to get his facts is from maybe inscriptions, maybe sculptures, maybe coins, etc. He collects all of them. But my dear students, have you wondered, how does he decide which facts to take? I've decided I want to write the history of Chandragupta Maurya. How do I decide what facts I want to choose? Carr puts it very beautifully when he tells us that the facts are not like a fish in a fish shop, where the fish has already been selected. It's not like that. Then what is it? He says it's like fish in an ocean. You just have to take this comparison very, very in detail, clearly to understand what Carr is saying about the choice of facts. Let me say that again for you. Not like fish in a fish shop, but like fish in the ocean. That means I, a fisherman, maybe an angler, I go to the ocean and then, like the historian has to collect his facts, like the fisherman has to collect his fish, catch his fish maybe, net his fish, angle for his fish, you need to sit somewhere. The fisherman needs to decide which part of the ocean he is going to. Which kind of fish are there, he probably knows or he probably doesn't know. And then, what is the net that he throws? What is the bait that he throws? Which kind of fish come there? What part of the year is it? What season is it? All this will determine what fish he is able to catch. He says, so too with the historian. Facts are required, he agrees. But then, what about the choice of facts? How do I decide? How does the historian decide which fact he wants to choose and which fact he does not want to choose? You might be wondering how all this is related to literature. But remember, my dear students, all literature, all literary texts are written in a historical context. That means a writer lives in a particular period. Something is happening then. Some things happen then. Some great events take place. And then the writer writes in that particular context. The great events of that period might not necessarily figure in his text. That doesn't matter. But yet, he is writing with that in the background. That forms the backdrop for his writings. And therefore, I'm trying to link for you the idea of history and literature. And therefore, when the historian goes to collect his facts, what does he do? Living in a particular place, living in a particular time, there are some accepted judgments. In this particular year, 2011, living in a country like India, maybe the writer already has certain facts chosen for him. And therefore, when he begins to write his history, he bases it on those facts which are already available for him. What does he do? He needs facts. Facts are important. And as somebody said, facts are all that are wanted in life. But then, once he has the facts, he has to choose which facts he wants to use. In choosing these facts, the judgments are based on the particular period in which he lives. That brings me to our next point, which is the philosophy of history. Which brings me to the next point, which is philosophy of history. What is the philosophy of history? This was something which began sometime when people started talking about history being only when the historian creates it. Facts of history, we are told, do not exist for any historian till he creates them. This term, philosophy of history, was invented by Voltaire. And he says that facts of history do not exist till the historian creates them. And history is an enormous jigsaw puzzle with a lot of missing parts. Facts of history and other facts of the past vanish because the few known facts are all facts of history. What does it mean? Some event has taken place in the past. The historian is writing about that event. Are these two separate? No. The philosophy of history says that the past event and the historians thought about it. Let us think of any event in history, something that happened 1,000 years ago. Let us think of that event and let us think of a historian looking at it in the Elizabethan age. Let us think of the historian looking at it in the Restoration age, looking at it again in the Neoclassical age, in the Romantic age, in the Victorian age, and then looking at it in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. My dear students, the event is the same. But when it gets recorded in history, it is not just the event as it happened. Yes, agreed, the date cannot be changed. The place cannot be changed. But the way we look at it will change depending on where we are. And that is why the event and the historian's point of view, the two of them, what happens mutually, how they act and react on each other, the interaction that takes place between the event that happened 1,000 years ago and the historian's recording of it. It is this mutual which gives rise to the concept of the philosophy of history. Let me say that again. The event is a single event, but the same event is being looked at in different ages, from different contexts, by different people. And then the history that is being written about that same event will vary, because the historian's concept of the event is bound to have some effect on the writing of the history. And that is why we say history is the reenactment in the historian's mind of the thought whose history he is studying. History is the reenactment, please remember, where in the historian's mind. That means the entire event is being reprocessed, and reprocessed. In a sense, it is being rewritten. And therefore, when the historian writes about it, he thinks about it. He reenacts it in his mind. I'm sure you've heard of the phrase crossing the Rubicon. Julius Caesar crossed this little river called the Rubicon. We say crossing the Rubicon to indicate an action on which you cannot go back. That means your entire future is dependent on that single action. Which means historians have decided at a particular point in time that if Caesar had not crossed the Rubicon at that given moment, at that time, maybe the events of history would have been different. The historian decided that it is that important strategic moment which determined the future of Caesar. So what is happening? Let me repeat that. It is the reenactment in the mind of the historian, the thought about the events that took place much earlier. And therefore, with each age, with each period, with each country maybe, with each nation, with each power structure, the same event could be written differently as history, because the reenactment is taking place in the mind of the historian. So, the writing of history, according to the philosophy of history, is not just recording an event in an objective manner. It means that the historian thinks about it and comes to his decision. That brings me to the next question: how pure is history? As we have already seen that it cannot be just one point, it just cannot be something that is being repeated in all ages by all historians. We have to see that all history is refracted through the mind of the recorder. And therefore, we've got 2 points that we have to remember here. We have to talk about history and we have to talk about the historian. Let me quote for you Professor Oakeshott, who says, "History is the historian's experience. History is the historian's experience. It is made by nobody save the historian. To write history is the only way of making it." Please listen to that again. History is the historian's experience. So here you have a historian who is writing about the Kalinga War, who is writing about Ashoka's transformation when he saw all the soldiers, all the bloodshed, all the soldiers lying dead, all the bloodshed. It is the historian, his experience, which creates the history, which gives Ashoka all those feelings. What we are trying to say here is that no event recorded in history is simply an event. What we have to remember is it is the historian's experience which comes into the picture before history is recorded. How is history made? To quote the same professor, it is the writing of history which is the making of history. That is, historians decide how an event is to be looked at. Which means we have to decide that we have to come to the conclusion that there's nothing as pure history. All history is history as written by the historian. In order to do that, a point that is important for historians is an imaginative understanding. Carr gives us a number of examples to show how, if the historian does not have an imaginative understanding, what he writes, what he puts across, what he records might be a very one-sided. He takes examples from the recent past. He talks about the British historian writing about the Soviet Union. He talks about how, if there is no imaginative understanding, that is, if the historian, if the recorder of history, if the writer of history does not have an understanding of what that party is going through. Because here he's talking about the British-Soviet relationship. When he's talking about that, he says, if the British historian is not able to view the events from the Soviet point of view, he says, then the history that is recorded will not be true history. Because remember, history, we know, is always written by the victor. But in order to be true history, in order to be factual, in order to be recording events as they took place, Carr tells us that what the historian, what the writer of history requires is an imaginative understanding. The British historian should be able to see what the Soviets feel about a particular event, about a particular incident, about a particular treaty, about a particular discussion, and see it also from the Soviets' point of view before he records it as history. And to this, Carr gives the term imaginative understanding. The next point that Carr makes is history is always viewing of the past through the present. Why? As I mentioned earlier, depending on whether you are living in the Elizabethan age, the Restoration age, the Neoclassical age, the Romantic age, or the Victorian age, or the 21st century, how you look at a particular event is going to matter, is going to change. Is it possible then to have a neutral language? All linguists, all theories of language tell us that there's nothing where a word is not loaded with some positive or negative meaning. My dear students, you and me, living in a democratic free India, probably use words like democracy with a particular meaning. But think of a dictatorial regime where the word democracy probably is loaded with negative meaning. Think of words like empire. Think of words like war. Think of words like revolution. These words are always loaded with meaning, and therefore the historian has to be careful to use neutral language. My dear students, we just celebrated Independence Day. Maybe some of you remember your history, Indian history. I remember a few years ago when all our books of history were written by the British. We referred to 1857 as the Sepoy Mutiny. I'm talking to you about the importance of language, the importance of trying to have a neutral language. Because the books were written by the British, it was called the Sepoy Mutiny. We gradually changed the word and began to call it the revolt. Later, we thought, no, we need a better word, and therefore we called it the First War of Independence. I'm giving you a very simple example. It's not from Thomas Carr. But in order to make the point clear, because if I relate it to the surroundings in which we live, to the country in which we live, I'm sure it'll become clearer how when a historian writes, when he records the events of the past, unless he uses a neutral language, the history might not be factual. The history might be a power play. And therefore, we must remember that when he is viewing the events of the past, the importance of a neutral language. When we look at history, there is always this question of dichotomy. What is the historian recording? Is the historian recording a fact, or is he recording his interpretation? I just gave you the example of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. The fact is that in a particular year, Julius Caesar, with a certain number of soldiers on a particular day, at a particular moment, maybe the time is recorded, he crossed the Rubicon. This is the fact. But what does the historian do? He interprets it. Therefore, you have this constant dichotomy between whether it's a fact or whether it's an interpretation. Let me say that again. The time is recorded, is noted. The place is noted. But then, what about the interpretation? How important is the crossing of the Rubicon? That is decided by the historian. Another point that is often made is that in the recording of history, there is a distinction, a dichotomy between the particular and the general. A historian is probably recording the events of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or to put it a little differently, the Industrial Revolution. There might be specific revolutions, but in recording the events, in interpreting the facts, he probably comes to certain general conclusions. Why revolutions take place? What is the process of revolution? What is the end of revolution? What are the good things that happen in a revolution? What are the bad things that happen in a revolution? So what is the historian doing? He has a particular revolution, but from that he moves on to the general. There is also the question of the dichotomy between the empirical and the theoretical. There is also the question of the dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. I've talked about it earlier also when we were talking about literature, when we started talking about what is history, and therefore I shall not repeat the point. Let us draw our conclusions of this essay. I'm talking about the essay by Thomas Carr, which is the historian and his facts. And therefore, what is the conclusion that we need to draw? History is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. An unending dialogue, my dear students, is an important phrase, because as long as history is being written, it will change. The dialogue will change. Because the past may remain the same, but the present will change depending on which moment the history is. And therefore, the conclusion that Thomas Carr arrives at is, the historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without the historian are dead and meaningless. Let me repeat that for you. The historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without their historian are dead and meaningless. And that is why Carr concludes this essay with, history is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. In this lecture, my dear students, I'm trying to deal with two essays of Thomas Carr. The second essay is called History, Science and Morality. Having looked at the historian and his facts, we are now moving on to the question as to whether history is a science. Is history a science? When we ask ourselves this question, some of you might immediately come up with the answer, no, it's not a pure science, but it is a social science. What do we mean by science? What are the sciences? And what is it that is common to all the sciences? Then maybe you would say that when we talk of something as being science, we say that it is possible to verify, it is possible to modify, and it is possible to refute. All science, probably, in order to propound a theory, begin with a hypothesis, right? Now the hypothesis has to be verified, if necessary, modified. And if we find that it doesn't work, it's not true, maybe the hypothesis was wrong, then what we need to do is to refute it. And it is argued that history cannot be a science. But you know something very interesting? In many European languages, in the word history, in the particular language, there is the inclusion of the idea of science. Strangely, in English, history does not have an inclusion of a word science in it. I was just telling you about the importance of hypothesis in sciences. But let me tell you, even in history, hypothesis is important. For example, very often we divide history into different periods. You know, these periods are only for convenience. It's not as if it's fixed. It makes it convenient for us to look at history by dividing India, the Indian history, into the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period. Then when you look into the ancient period, you've got the different dynasties which ruled. Then when you look at the dynasties, you've got the different kings who ruled. In the same way, you could do to the medieval period, you could do to British India, or to the modern period. What I'm drawing your attention to is, it is wrong to say that in history there is no hypothesis. In history also there is hypothesis. And where there is hypothesis, there should be the possibility of verification. There are some writers there are some thinkers, according to Carr, who object to calling history a science because of certain reasons. Let's look at those reasons. 1. History deals with unique and the science with general. The first objection, according to these writers, is that history deals with the unique and science with the general. In this essay, History, Science and Morality, Carr looks at each one of these objections and gives us answers why these objections are not true. He attempts in a very detailed way to give us answers to each one of these objections and to refute them in a very, very scientific way. He says the first objection is that history deals with the unique and science with the general. He says no. Why? Because no two historical events, incidents are identical. And therefore, what happens is everything is moving gradually towards the general. It's not unique, but moving towards the general. Looking at a series of events or similar events. Let us look at wars. Look at battles. What the historian does is comes to certain conclusions about battles, about wars. The second objection is that history teaches no lessons. He refutes that argument too by telling us that it is unfair to have such an objection towards history, because he says every generalization, he relates it to the first objection. He says history deals with the general, and from that he comes to the conclusion that there are many lessons of history. When we look at ancient Greece and we look at ancient Rome, we know that there were many lessons that one civilization learned from the other. He says, and therefore it is wrong to say, he refutes the argument that history teaches no lessons. The third objection is that history is unable to predict. Science can predict that because of the law of gravity, we are told that the apple will fall. Carr gives us a beautiful example. Yes, the apple should fall because of the law of gravity. But science does not tell us that if I hold a pail, a basket, in front of, below the falling apple, the apple is not going to reach the ground. So has science been able to predict that a particular apple will not fall down? He talks about the optical rays, and he says we know that the optical rays travel in a straight line. But something could come in its way, something could stand in the way, something could prove an obstacle by which the light cannot travel in a straight line. Does science predict this? He says in the same way, history also can predict. That if you have these things, if these incidents take place, if the people are unhappy, if this happens, then a revolution is likely to take place. If a king goes into particular battle because of these circumstances, he is likely to fail. So he says history also can predict. The next point that people say about history, that history is subjective and science is objective. Carr raises a question about the validity of such an objection. And he says, no, there is a principle of uncertainty or indeterminacy. And he goes on to say that there is a dichotomy between the known subject and the object that you want to know. This was a dichotomy that was accepted earlier. But he says now, in the 20th century and in the 21st century, we do not place the subject and the object totally being unrelated. We have to accept that the subject and the object are interrelated. This is true of science. This is true as much of history. He also says that it is argued that history involves religion and morality and science does not. And therefore, history cannot be a science. Carr argues that just because you are an astronomer, it does not mean that you should not believe that God created the universe. Just because you are a historian, you do not have to refute, you do not have to question the existence of God. Fine. He says, just like an astronomer who believes in God does not believe that the movement, the orbit of planets can be changed, in the same way, the historian does not believe that events took place because of particular reasons that are attributed to a power above us. So he refutes that argument also, that history is different from science because history involves religion, whereas science does not. In this way, Carr refutes all the arguments and then talks about the historian versus the moralist. Is a historian a moralist? And are they doing the same thing? He says, no. The historian is a historian, and his standpoints are not identical with the moralist. And the argument that he gives for this is that the historian has no right to pass judgment on private lives. Yes, the historian, in the writing of history, does pass judgment on events, on institutions, and on policies. But nowhere does he pass a moral judgment on the private lives of those individuals who were involved in these events, these institutions, and these policies. And that is why he concludes that the historian is not a judge. The historian is not a judge. A moralist can be a judge. So in this essay, which is beautifully titled History, Science and Morality, Carr tells us that the historian is not a judge, still less a hanging judge. Remember, what the historian is attempting to do, my dear students, is very different from what the moralist is attempting to do. And therefore, the historian is not a judge, still less a hanging judge. I think we have looked at three essays which were tough, which were difficult, which need a lot of concentration, which need to be read in great depth before we can understand it. But in this new syllabus that we are looking at, my dear students, there is something which is also of great interest, because it's great fun, because it's about the medieval romance. I began my lecture today by first attempting to define what is literature. We moved on to history and facts. From history and facts, we moved on to history, science and morality. And in the next few minutes, I would like to very quickly talk about medieval romance. The concept of romance has to be understood only when we can understand first the concept of an epic. An epic, my dear students, in Gujarat is a Mahakavya. And when we think of India, of course, we remember the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. When we think of epics, we think of huge, voluminous book. We think of hundreds of stories. We think of great characters occupying the space there. We think of gods and goddesses, and maybe demons too. We think of wars and battles. We think of the entire gamut of human experience. But as students of English literature, I'm sure you've also heard of Homer's Iliad. You've heard of Virgil's Aeneid. When we talk about the epics of European literature, these are the names that come to mind. But I want to take you to the pre-Chaucerian era, where we have what is called the first existing epic in the English language. And the name of the book is Beowulf. A little difficult for you to remember and even pronounce. But then it is an ancient epic. What we're going to look at now very quickly is the difference between the epic and the romance. An epic is a huge work. An epic has solidity. An epic has weight. There are many characters who inhabit the world of the epic. What happens in a romance? We take one single character and some events in his life. When they are described, we call that a romance. Let us think of the Trojan War. Let us think of Homer's Iliad. One of the characters very interesting characters is Ulysses, called Odysseus, called Ulysses. And then you have his adventures. We talk about the sirens. We talk about Scylla and Charybdis. We talk about all his experiences, and these could give rise to romances. In one of the universities, we have the medieval romance as part of the syllabus. And there, we talk about the medieval romances of England. You know, one of the great characters of romance in English literature is Arthur. You must have heard of King Arthur and the Round Table. You must have heard of knights. Remember, my dear students, when I'm talking of knight, I'm talking of knight spelt with a capital K. And one interesting book that is prescribed for you, you don't have to read the book. You must only know about the book. And that is Gawain and the Green Knight. An interesting story of Gawain. And what happens? Knights ride out in their horses and they go out and fight. Fight battles, probably to save damsels in distress. Do have a look at this entry in your Oxford Guide or Cambridge Guide, and you will understand what the story is, Gawain and the Green Knight. Go back to your books, my dear students, and look at these essays again in a new light. I'm sure the points that you've been noting in the course of this lecture will make it easier for you to understand, for you to look at the points that have been raised in these essays. Difficult though the essays may seem initially, I think they are a challenging entry for you, first-year students, into the wonderful world of English literature. And I'm sure the 3 years that you're going to be with literature, with English language and English literature, is going to be a fruitful and meaningful experience for all of you. Take it in your stride and see what Eagleton and Carr have done for you in your understanding of literature, of literary history, of historian and its facts, and then in very, very short terms, what I've tried to tell you about the medieval romance in England. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture as much as I have in bringing it across to you. And your appreciation of literature will grow from day to day. Thank you very much.